At 6:12 a.m. on a cold September morning in 1978, the rusted combine coughed twice, backfired once, and died in the middle of 312 acres of standing corn. Daniel Mercer sat in the cab and did the math again because numbers were easier than feelings. 312 acres. Average yield projected at 118 bushels per acre. That meant roughly 36,800 bushels waiting in the field. The first frost usually hit around October 28th. That gave him 42 days. If the machine held, he needed to clear at least 8 acres a day. If it didn't, he was done. The combine was a 1961 Alice Chalmers Gleaner, bought at auction for $460. The seller called it field ready. That was generous. The header leaned right by almost 2 inches. The grain tank had a seam welded so poorly it looked stapled shut. The hour meter didn't work. Neither did the temperature gauge. Daniel turned the key again. Nothing. He shut his eyes for 5 seconds, not praying, just calculating. Across the gravel lane, leaning against the fence post like he'd been there all night, stood his grandfather, Thomas Mercer, 70 years old, hands in his coat pockets, watching without expression. Thomas had farmed that land since 1949. He had buried a son in 1976. He had not buried another. Daniel climbed down from the cab and walked toward him. "Fuel line's choking," Daniel said. Thomas nodded once. "Told you that machine was tired. So am I." That earned the slightest twitch at the corner of the old man's mouth. Not a smile, just acknowledgement. Then Thomas said the sentence that had been sitting between them for 3 weeks. "You've got 39 days left." Daniel already knew that. 3 days had gone to unloading, repairs, and the first breakdown. 39 days. 304 acres remaining. He had cleared 8. He needed to average just over 8 per day now to stay on track. "You can still quit," Thomas said evenly. "No shame in it. You tried." Daniel felt that in his chest. Not anger, not hurt, something sharper. "You said 1 season," Daniel replied. "You said if I bring it in myself, no loans, no custom crews, no touching your deer in the shed, you sign over the south half." Thomas didn't look away. That was the deal. The south half meant 156 acres. If Daniel failed, he left. Not to another part of the farm. Not to try again next year. Left. The land would be leased to Peterson Farms, who had already offered cash up front. Daniel had seen the numbers. Peterson could harvest the entire spread in 12 days with 2 modern combines. Daniel had 1 machine that stalled before breakfast. Thomas pushed off the fence. 42 days sounded long at the start, he said. They go quicker than you think. Daniel walked back to the combine. He didn't answer, because both of them knew this wasn't about acres. 3 years earlier, Daniel's father, Mark Mercer, had rolled a finance tractor on County Road 6. The loan was $18,000. The tractor was brand new. The payments weren't. When the rear tire blew at transport speed, the machine flipped into the ditch. Mark died before the ambulance reached him. Thomas paid off the remaining balance within 6 months. Sold cattle. Emptied savings. Parked the Deere 4430 in the back shed and never turned the key again. Daniel had been 20 then. He had heard the arguments about expansion, about leverage, about opportunity. He had watched his father push. He had watched his grandfather refuse. Now he was 23 and standing between those 2 ghosts with a broken combine and no credit line. He pulled the fuel line free and blew through it. Sludge. He cleaned it with diesel from a coffee can, reattached it, and climbed back into the cab. The engine caught this time. Rough. Unstable. Alive. He eased forward. The header swallowed the first row unevenly. The cylinder rattled harder than it should. He listened like a doctor listening to lungs. Too much vibration on the left. He adjusted ground speed down notch. 8 acres by dark. That was the target. By noon he had 3. At 1:17 p.m., the feeder chain slipped. At 1:24 p.m., it snapped. Daniel shut down, climbed out, and dragged tools from the truck. Thomas did not move from the fence line. He did not offer help. That was part of the agreement. If Daniel could not maintain the machine alone, he did not deserve the ground. It took 48 minutes to replace the chain with a spare he had bought at auction. When he restarted, he was behind pace. At sunset, he had cleared 4 acres, not 8, 4. He wrote it down in a small notebook. Remaining acres, 297. 6. Required average from tomorrow forward, 8.06 acres per day. Margin shrinking. That night, he slept in the cab of his pickup because going back to the farmhouse meant conversation. And conversation meant doubt. On the 5th day, he hit 8 acres. On the 6th, 9. On the 7th, rain started. Not heavy, just steady enough to shut him down. Rain meant mud. Mud meant ruts. Ruts meant breakdowns. 3 days lost. By the time the field dried, he was 14 acres behind schedule. Required average, 8.9 per day. That was the point most men would have borrowed help. Peterson drove by on a county road that Thursday and slowed his truck. He didn't get out. He didn't need to. The message was visible in the size of his equipment. Daniel kept his eyes forward and cut the rows he could reach. That night at the hardware store in town, 2 older farmers were talking loud enough to be heard. Kids burning daylight, one said. Pride's expensive. Daniel bought 2 belts and a grease gun and left without speaking. When he returned to the farm, there was a thermos sitting on the tailgate of his truck. No note, just coffee. Thomas was nowhere in sight. Daniel did not look toward the house. He drank half of it standing up and went back to work. Day 12, 102 acres done. Required average holding at 9. 1. Engine burning oil faster. He added a cord at lunch. Day 15, hydraulic line split. Lost half a day replacing it. Day 18, 154 acres complete. Halfway, 17 days gone. 25 left before typical frost. Required pace, 9.3. Still mathematically possible. Emotionally, less so. On day 21, the town feed store became the turning point. Daniel went in for a set of bearings he had ordered. Inside were Harold Benton, who farmed 800 acres, and Carl Dawson, the implement dealer. Carl leaned on the counter and studied him like inventory. You're halfway, I hear, Carl said. More than halfway. You won't make it, Harold said plainly. Not without real equipment. Carl nodded. By the time it turned over again, he was 22 acres behind where he needed to be. Required average, 10. 4 acres per day. That was beyond what the machine had shown it could do consistently. That evening, Thomas finally walked across the yard while Daniel was tightening bolts on the header. You're behind, the old man said quietly. I know. Peterson renewed his offer. Daniel didn't look up. I know. Silence stretched. Then Thomas added, Frost came early in 63. Daniel wiped his hands. It might not this year. Thomas studied him for a long moment. It might. And that was the truth neither of them could calculate. On day 30, Daniel ran 12 acres. His best day yet. He did it by starting before full light and running until he could barely see the row markers. His hands shook from fatigue when he shut down. Remaining acres, 86. Days until historical frost window, 12. Required pace, 7.1. For the first time, the math leaned in his favor. He allowed himself 5 seconds of relief. On day 31, the cylinder began to whine. High-pitched, metallic. He recognized the sound, bearing failure coming. He finished the pass he was on and shut down. If the cylinder seized, it would tear the belts and maybe the shaft. He checked inventory. He did not have the right bearing. The nearest salvage yard that might carry one was in Riverton, 2 hours away. He checked his cash. $312 left. The part, if available, would likely cost most of it. He stood there in the field, 74 acres left, 11 days on the calendar, and felt the weight shift. Because this was the moment the season would turn one direction or the other. He climbed in the truck and drove toward Riverton as the sun went down, not knowing yet that back at the farmhouse, in the top drawer of Thomas Mercer's desk, there was an envelope that had been sealed 3 years earlier with Daniel's name written across the front, and that what was inside it would matter far more than any bearing ever could. Daniel reached Riverton at 9:43 p.m., the salvage yard half lit by a single sodium lamp over the office door. He did not expect anyone to be there. Someone was. An older man in a flannel jacket looked up from a ledger as Daniel walked in carrying the old bearing wrapped in a rag. Need this, Daniel said. The man took it, wiped grease off the numbers stamped into the steel, and disappeared into the yard without a word. Daniel stood there doing math in his head. 74 acres left. 11 days before frost window. Required average, 6, 7 per day if he lost no more time. The cylinder had not failed yet, but it would. 10 minutes later, the man came back with a small box. Last one, he said, came off a 62 Gleaner. 280. Daniel counted out the cash. After fuel to get home, he would have less than $20 left. No margin. He drove back through the dark, headlights fixed on the 2 white lines in front of him, and kept replaying the sound the cylinder had made. If he installed the bearing wrong, if the shaft was already damaged, if the housing cracked when he pressed it in, the season was over. He reached the farm at 12:11 a.m. The house was dark. The shed light was on. Thomas was inside, sitting on an overturned bucket near the workbench, not speaking. Daniel set the box down and opened it. "You find one," Thomas said. "Yes." "How much?" $2.80. Thomas nodded once. No lecture. No comment about money. Daniel pulled the cylinder housing apart. The old bearing came free with resistance. It was worse than he expected. Metal shavings in the grease. He cleaned everything twice, pressed the replacement in slowly, checked alignment by hand, rotated the shaft. Smooth. He reassembled, replaced belts that had begun to fray, and climbed into the cab at 2:37 a.m. Thomas stood outside, arms crossed, watching. The engine started on the 3rd turn. Daniel engaged the header briefly, listening. No whine, no grind, just the steady mechanical thrum of something that might survive a little longer. He shut it down and went to sleep in the truck for 3 hours. At sunrise, he was cutting again. Day 32, 13, 2 acres. His best output yet. He pushed the machine hard, but not stupid. Every vibration meant something now. Every rattle had a consequence. Remaining acres, 60. 8 days until frost window, 9. Required pace, 6, 7. Achievable. For the first time since the season began, the numbers were not against him. On day 33, the weather shifted. Forecast said low 30s at night by the weekend. Frost could come earlier. It did not matter what the average window was. It mattered what the sky decided. Daniel ran 10 acres before noon. At 1:06 p.m., the clean grain auger jammed. He shut down immediately. A broken cob had lodged in the flighting. It took 40 minutes to clear. Lost time, lost momentum. He forced himself not to rush when he restarted. Rushing was how shafts bent and belts snapped. By dusk, he had 49 acres left. Required pace, 6-1. Thomas had begun walking out to the field more often. He never crossed into the rows, never touched the machine. He just stood at the edge and watched, as if memorizing something. That evening, when Daniel came back to the yard, there was a plate sitting on the truck hood under foil. Roast beef. Potatoes. No note. Daniel ate standing up. He did not look toward the house. He did not need to. Day 34. Fog until 9 m. Moisture meant he could not start immediately. He paced. Calculated again. If frost hit in 5 days instead of 9, he would need 9. 8 acres per day. The machine had proven it could do that only twice. Full geliefd. He ran 11 acres. Remaining, 38. Day 35. Wind picked up. Wind helped dry stalks. He ran 12. Remaining, 26. He allowed himself exactly one thought of victory and then shut it down. Day 36 began with silence. The combine would not turn over. The battery had drained overnight. He checked terminals. Corrosion. He cleaned them. Nothing. He checked voltage with an old meter he kept in the toolbox. Weak. He had no money left for a new battery. He considered pulling one from the truck, but knew he would need the truck if something else failed. He rolled the combine downhill and attempted to push start again. It caught on the second try. He did not shut it off all day. He ran 13 acres. Remaining, 13. Days until predicted frost. 4. Required pace, 3:25. That number felt almost gentle, almost safe, which is why the universe did what it did next. Late afternoon, as he cut across a slight incline, the header caught uneven ground and twisted. The bent side he had been compensating for all season shifted further out of alignment. He stopped immediately. Inspected. The frame had cracked at the earlier heat straightening point. If it failed completely, he would be done. 13 acres left. He could almost see the end from where he stood. Thomas walked across the yard without waiting this time. He crouched by the header and ran a hand along the crack. "You can weld it," Thomas said. "It'll hold if you don't push it." Daniel nodded. They carried the portable welder together. Thomas did not take the torch. He handed it over. Daniel welded carefully, reinforcing the weak point with a strip of steel cut from scrap in the shed. The repair took 2 hours. 2 hours he did not have. By the time he finished, the light was fading. Thomas stood up slowly. 3 days, he said. Daniel knew. He restarted and cut until he could not see the row tips clearly. 6 acres done. 7 remaining. He shut down at 8:19 p.m. Frost advisory issued for the night after next. Not tomorrow. The night after. That gave him 1 full day and a partial one. 7 acres. The math said easy. The machine said nothing. He lay in the truck staring at the cab roof for a long time before sleeping. Day 37 dawned colder than expected. The ground crunched faintly under his boots. Not frost. Close. He started at first light. The combine sounded different. Not wrong. Just tired. He cut 4 acres by noon. 3 left. He calculated fuel. Enough. Oil. Low but manageable. He added half a quart. Thomas did not appear in the field that morning. Daniel noticed. He did not let himself wonder why. At 2:43 p.m., with 2 acres left, the drive belt snapped. He heard it before he felt it. A sharp crack and sudden loss of motion. He shut down instantly. He had 1 spare left. 1. He replaced it in 12 minutes, hands moving fast but steady. Restarted. Finished the row. 1 acre left. The sun had dipped lower than he liked. The temperature had dropped again. He could feel it in his fingers through the steering wheel. He took the final pass slower than any other. Not because he was afraid of failure, because he understood what finishing meant. When the last row fell into the header, he checked the clock. 5:58 p.m. He emptied the grain tank into the truck and drove toward the bins. Thomas was standing there. No fence this time. No distance. Just waiting. Daniel cut the engine. Silence filled the space between them. "That's 312, Daniel said. Thomas nodded once. "You made it." It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it was the first clear approval Daniel had heard from him in 3 years. Daniel felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Daniel recognized his own name written across the front in ink that had faded slightly. "I wrote this after your father died," Thomas said. "I didn't know if you'd ever come back." Daniel took it. The paper felt older than it should have. "Open it inside," Thomas said quietly. Daniel looked up. For the first time since the season began, his grandfather did not look hard. He looked tired and afraid of something that had nothing to do with Frost. Daniel walked toward the house with the envelope in his hand, not yet knowing that what was written inside would change the meaning of everything that had just happened. Daniel closed the front door behind him and stood in the quiet kitchen with the envelope still in his hand. He did not sit. He did not open it immediately. For 37 days, everything had been numbers. Acres left, days left, dollars left. This was the first thing all season that could not be calculated. He broke the seal slowly. The paper inside was folded once. The handwriting was firm, controlled, unmistakably Thomas Mercer's. Daniel read the first line, standing under the dim overhead light. "If you were reading this, then you chose to come back." He exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. He kept reading. "I made a mistake with your father. I believed saying no was enough. I believed refusing debt was wisdom in itself. I never explained the weight behind it. I never showed him what it cost to lose control of your own ground." Daniel swallowed. He read on. "If you try to earn this land without borrowing, without leaning on the easy road, then you understand something your father never had time to learn. If you finish the harvest on your own terms, the south half is yours. If you walk away, I will not blame you. I am afraid of burying another Mercer." Daniel stopped there. He read that last line twice. afraid of burying another Mercer. For the first time, the season shifted in his mind. The challenge had never been about the south half. It had been about fear. His grandfather had not been guarding land. He had been guarding a grave. Daniel folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. He did not feel triumph. He felt understanding. When he stepped back outside, Thomas was still near the bins, hands resting on the wooden rail. "You could have given it to me before," Daniel said quietly. Thomas nodded. "I wasn't sure you were ready. Or you weren't." Thomas looked at him then, not as a foreman, not as a judge, but as a man who had lost something once and did not intend to lose it again. "Both," he said. They stood there without speaking for nearly a full minute. The sun had disappeared entirely. The temperature had dropped further. Frost would come in hours. Daniel glanced toward the field one last time. The rows now cut clean, the work complete. "It's done," he said. Thomas nodded once more. "It's done." The next morning, frost coated the stubble white. Daniel walked the edge of the field early, boots crunching lightly. If the machine had failed one day earlier, the frost would have taken yield. He knew that. He also knew that the margin had been thinner than anyone else understood. He returned to the shed and looked at the gleaner in silence. It was scarred, welded in 3 places. One panel wired tight where bolts had stripped. Oil streaked down the engine block. It looked like a machine that should not have made it. Thomas came in behind him. "You're not done yet," the old man said. Daniel turned. "Harvest is." Thomas shook his head. "Paperwork isn't." They sat at the small desk in the farmhouse that afternoon. The deed to the south half had been prepared weeks earlier. Thomas had written Daniel's name into the transfer space, but had not signed. He slid the pen across the desk. His hand did not shake when he signed. When Daniel signed beneath him, it felt heavier than any wrench he had lifted all season. 156 acres. Paid for. No lien. No bank. No payments. It was not expansion. It was continuation. The news traveled through town by evening. By the following week, 3 different people stopped by the farm to congratulate Daniel, which meant they had doubted him and wanted to measure the result with their own eyes. Harold Benton came first. He leaned against the truck the same way he had leaned at the hardware store. "Heard you made it," he said. Daniel nodded. "Barely counts," Harold added. "That machine won't survive another year." Daniel did not argue. He knew the truth of that. Later that afternoon, Carl Dawson drove in from town in his dealership pickup. He parked close to the shed. "So you proved a point," Carl said evenly. "Now what?" "Now I farm," Daniel replied. Carl studied the gleaner through the open shed door. "You could still trade up. Interest rates are reasonable." Daniel shook his head. "No loans." Carl smiled faintly. "Pride again." Daniel met his eyes. "Control." Carl did not press further. When he left, Thomas stepped out of the house and watched the truck disappear down the gravel lane. "They'll keep coming," Thomas said. "They always do." Daniel nodded. He understood that this was not a single-season test. It was a philosophy test. Winter came early that year. Daniel spent December and January rebuilding the combine properly. He replaced bearings, rebuilt the header frame instead of just reinforcing it, rewired loose connections, cleaned out the grain tank entirely. Thomas worked beside him now without distance. They did not talk much about Mark Mercer. They did not need to. It existed in the space between every bolt they tightened. By February, the machine looked different. Not new, but solid. Daniel ran numbers again, this time for planting season. With 156 acres under his name and the remaining acreage still under Thomas's control, the workload was manageable without outside help. Seed costs were tight, but possible. He would have to repair instead of replace. He would have to maintain instead of upgrade. It meant long days again. It meant no cushion. It also meant no debt. In March, interest rates began climbing. Banks tightened lending. By summer, 2 farms within 5 miles listed acreage for sale after missing payments. Daniel noticed. Thomas noticed more. "This is how it starts," Thomas said one evening while checking fence lines. "Boom makes men brave. Rates make them honest." Daniel absorbed that without response. He did not feel superior. He felt cautious. The next harvest season approached with different pressure. This time there was no bet, no written challenge. just land that was legally his and expectation that he would protect it. The gleaner ran smoother that fall. Daniel averaged 10 acres per day consistently. The repairs had mattered. He finished early. Frost came on schedule. No drama. No spectacle. Just work completed on time. In town, conversation shifted slightly. The words changed from kid to Daniel. Subtle but real. That winter, Peterson Farms went to auction on 2 leased parcels after an aggressive expansion stalled under rising interest. Daniel attended the auction quietly. He did not bid. He watched equipment sell below value. He watched men calculate loss in their heads the way he had calculated acres the year before. The difference was they were calculating what they owed, not what they owned. When Daniel returned home that night, Thomas was sitting by the window overlooking the south half, the half now legally Daniel's. "You see it," Thomas said without turning. "Yes. Debt feels like growth until it isn't." Daniel nodded slowly. "I see it." 3 years later, Thomas Mercer died in his chair by that same window. No accident, no machine, just age. Daniel found him in the morning, glasses still on, hands folded. There was no new envelope in the desk drawer. There did not need to be. At the funeral, half the county filled the church. Not because Thomas had been friendly. He hadn't. They came because his land had never gone to auction. They came because the farm was still intact. Daniel did not read the letter that day. He did not need to explain it. He had lived it. After the service, Carl Dawson approached him quietly. "You were right not to borrow," Carl said. Daniel shook his head. "My grandfather was." Carl nodded. Most of us were selling what men wanted to hear. Daniel looked past him toward the fields beyond the parking lot. "Want and need aren't the same," he said. Years passed. The gleaner finally gave out for good in the early 90s. Daniel did not sell it. He parked at the back of the shed, clean covered. When his own son, Matthew, turned 18, he asked why they kept an old machine that no longer ran. Daniel walked him out to the shed, pulled back the tarp, and ran his hand across the welded seam along the header frame. "This machine taught me something," he said. Matthew waited. Daniel looked at the patchwork steel, the replaced bearings, the places where metal had been forced to hold when it wanted to break. "It proved something," he finished. Matthew nodded slowly, not fully understanding yet. Daniel did not explain further. Some lessons are not transferred by speech. They're earned by standing in a field with a machine that may not start in a deadline that does not care how you feel. And somewhere in the farmhouse, in a drawer that had not been opened in years, lay a folded letter that had turned a season of survival into a lifetime of ownership. The year after Thomas Mercer's funeral was the hardest Daniel had ever farmed. Not because of machinery, not because of weather, but because the responsibility no longer had a shadow standing behind it. The south half was his name. The north half had transferred fully after probate closed that spring. 312 acres now rested entirely on his decisions. No one to argue with, no one to defy, no one to prove wrong. That silence was heavier than criticism had ever been. The first test came in April when input prices climbed faster than projected. Seed up 12%. Fertilizer up 15%. Fuel volatile. The bank in town mailed out new financing packages to every farmer in the county. Pre-approved operating lines. Attractive terms. Flexible repayment. Daniel placed the envelope unopened in the kitchen drawer and left it there. He recalculated instead. Lower input density. Conservative yield assumptions. Tight cost control. Margin thinner, but stable. He knew what margin felt like now. He respected it. By midsummer, drought rolled in early. Rainfall sat at 60% of average. Corn tasseled under heat stress. Neighbors began irrigating aggressively, pumping fuel into the ground to protect yields. Daniel considered it. He had capacity to lease a pump. It would mean signing a short-term note. He stood in the field, one evening running numbers in his head. Best case, yield preserved. Worst case, rain comes late anyway, and debt lingers. He chose restraint. Yield dipped slightly that year, but so did expenses. Net remained positive. Not large. Positive was enough. In town, a quiet divide began forming. Those expanding, modernizing, leveraging, and those tightening, repairing, enduring. Daniel did not preach. He did not criticize. He worked. The following year, interest rates jumped sharply. 2 farms north of County Road, 6 defaulted before harvest. Equipment lined up along gravel like a funeral procession. Daniel attended one auction and left early. He did not enjoy watching men lose things they had built. That night, he sat alone at the kitchen table long after dark and opened the old envelope again. The paper had softened at the folds. I am afraid of burying another Mercer. He understood something new in that sentence now. Fear had not been weakness. It had been memory. Daniel closed the letter and placed it back. Autumn came strong that year. Perfect drying conditions. The combine replacement he had purchased secondhand, paid in full, cash from 3 careful seasons, ran clean. No drama. No emergency welds. He finished harvest with days to spare. Stability, he realized, was quieter than struggle. It did not draw attention. It did not earn applause. It simply persisted. Matthew was 12 when he first rode beside Daniel during harvest. Not driving, just watching. Daniel explained numbers more than mechanics. Acres left, yield per acre, cost per acre, break-even points. Matthew listened seriously. Why don't we get a bigger machine? He asked once. Daniel answered without hesitation. Because we don't need one. That answer carried more weight than it sounded like. Need to become the filter for every decision. Not want, not pride, need. In 1984, grain prices dropped sharply. Storage filled fast. Buyers slow to move product. Cash flow tightened across the county. Daniel adjusted. Delayed non-essential repairs. Deferred upgrades. Maintained liquidity. Others borrowed to float through the dip. Some survived. Some did not. The line between them often traced back to earlier decisions made in better years. Daniel began to see patterns. Expansion during high prices. Optimism during easy credit. Then contraction, forced sales, stress. It was not that growth was wrong. It was that timing without cushion was dangerous. One evening in late October, Matthew, now 16, asked about his grandfather directly. Was he hard on you? Daniel thought for a moment. He was afraid, he said. Matthew frowned slightly. Of what? Of losing the only thing he couldn't rebuild. Matthew looked out toward the dark field beyond the kitchen window. Did he think you'd die like Dad did? Daniel did not answer immediately. He thought risk doesn't negotiate, he said finally. It collects. That winter, a severe ice storm tore through the county. Power lines down for days. Bins iced over. Daniel and Matthew worked through it without complaint. Work had never been the enemy. Only carelessness had. By spring, Daniel made a decision he had resisted for years. He purchased an adjacent 80-acre parcel from a retiring neighbor. Cash. Paid at closing. No loan. It stretched reserves thin, but did not cross into debt. Matthew watched the transaction quietly. Later that night, he asked, "Is that expansion?" Daniel smiled faintly. "It's addition. What's the difference?" "One you can afford, even if prices fall in half." Matthew nodded slowly. The lesson was landing. As the years moved forward, Daniel became known less as the kid who proved something and more as the man who never overextended. Younger farmers asked advice occasionally. He rarely gave direct instructions. He asked them questions instead. What's your break even? What happens if rates climb? What happens if weather shifts 2 weeks earlier? Most had not run those numbers fully. Some did after speaking with him. Some didn't. The farm continued steady. No dramatic seasons. No heroic saves. Just discipline. Then came the year that nearly broke the county entirely. Interest rates spiked into the mid-teens. Commodity prices slumped. Land values dropped nearly 40%. Loans structured during boom years reset under brutal terms. Auctions multiplied. 11 farms within a 10-mile radius changed hands in 3 years. Daniel attended several, not as bidder, but as witness. He saw Harold Benton's machinery lined up with chalk numbers on the tires. He saw Carl Dawson's dealership struggle under repossessions. He saw pride collapse under paperwork. One afternoon, after an especially heavy auction, Carl drove out to Daniel's place unannounced. He stepped out of the truck looking older than his years. "You were right," Carl said simply. Daniel shook his head. "No," he answered. "My grandfather was." Carl exhaled slowly. I told men to borrow when money was cheap. I told them scale fixed everything. Daniel leaned against the shed door. Scale amplifies mistakes, he said quietly. Carl nodded. I see that now. The conversation did not last long. It did not need to. The correction had already been written in public view. That winter, Daniel found Matthew standing in the old shed looking at the covered gleaner. Does it still run? Matthew asked. No. Why keep it? Daniel walked over and pulled back the tarp halfway. The metal still bore scars from that first season. Reinforced header, replaced bearing housing, uneven paint along the weld seam. Because it reminds me what almost failing feels like, Daniel said. Matthew touched the steel carefully. Did you ever think you wouldn't make it? Daniel answered honestly. Yes. Then why didn't you quit? Daniel paused. He could have said pride. He could have said land. Instead, he said, because quitting would have proved the wrong thing. Matthew looked confused for a moment, then thoughtful. Some answers mature over time. In the spring of 1990, Daniel rewrote his own will. It was brief, clear, direct. Land divided equally between his children, conditional on one clause. No leveraged expansion beyond operating credit for crop inputs. He did not forbid growth. He forbade dependency. He placed a copy in the same desk drawer where Thomas's envelope had once rested. The paper felt heavier than its weight suggested. Years later, when Matthew stood in the field at dawn beside his own son, Daniel saw the repetition of posture more than the repetition of face. Hands on hips, eyes scanning horizon, calculating silently. The farm had not grown massive. It had not become the largest operation in the county. It had done something quieter. It had survived cycles that erased others. It had remained owned, not owed. And in the quiet evenings when the machinery cooled and the sky darkened without urgency, Daniel sometimes felt the presence of his grandfather, not as a memory, but as a standard. Not perfection, not stubbornness. A standard. Risk understood. Control preserved. Fear acknowledged, but not obeyed. The gleaner stayed in the shed, not as nostalgia, as evidence. Evidence that the hardest season of a man's life can become the foundation of the rest of it. And evidence that the difference between pride and principle is often measured not in acres gained, but in ground kept. The first time Daniel let Matthew drive the combine alone, he did not stand beside him. He did not hover. He watched from the edge of the field the way Thomas once had, hands resting on his hips, expression unreadable. Matthew was 21 then. The machine was not the old gleaner. That one had long since retired to the back of the shed. This was a paid-for-use case, clean, maintained, nothing flashy. Matthew ran the first pass steady. Not fast, not cautious, just steady. Daniel listened to the engine from a distance the way he used to listen for bearing wine and belt tension. Some habits never leave. The pass finished clean. Matthew turned at the end row without overcorrecting. Daniel felt something settle inside him. Not pride exactly. Recognition. Later that evening, Matthew shut down near the bins and climbed down. Feels different when you're alone in the cab, he said. Daniel nodded. It should. You worry? Matthew asked. Daniel considered that. Always, he said. But worry doesn't drive the machine. Matthew understood more now than he had years earlier in the shed staring at welded steel. The farm had made that clear. In 1993, land prices surged again. Investors began circling rural acreage. Calls came in offering purchase prices Daniel had never imagined when he first fought for the South half. One call in particular stood out. A developer from out of state offering enough to retire comfortably twice over. Daniel listened. He wrote the number down. He folded the paper and placed it beside the old envelope in the desk drawer. That night at dinner, he mentioned it plainly. We could sell, he said. Matthew did not react immediately. And then what, he asked. Invest. Move. Start something else. Matthew shook his head slowly. We don't own this to trade it. Daniel studied his son carefully. Why do we own it? Matthew answered without hesitation. So no one can tell us how to run it. That was the moment Daniel understood the lesson had transferred fully. It was no longer his discipline alone. It was culture. The offer was declined the next morning. In the late 90s, agriculture shifted again. Technology accelerated. GPS guidance, precision application, data tracking. Matthew pushed for adopting some of it. Daniel did not resist automatically the way Thomas once had. He asked questions instead. Cost, lifespan, return per acre. After running the numbers, they adopted selectively. Paid cash where possible, leased only when returns were measurable. Control remained the boundary. The farm modernized carefully without surrendering autonomy. The old gleaner stayed where it was. Dust settled on the tarp, but never fully covered it. One summer afternoon, Matthew's young son, Caleb, wandered into the shed and pulled the tarp back out of curiosity. "What's this?" he asked. Matthew called Daniel over. Together, they uncovered the machine completely for the first time in years. Caleb ran his hand along the welded seam, just like Matthew once had. "Why didn't you throw it away?" the boy asked. Daniel crouched slowly despite stiff knees. "Because that machine decided something," he said. "What?" Caleb pressed. Daniel glanced at Matthew, then back at the steel. "It decided whether we would owe or own." Caleb did not fully understand, but he nodded as if he did. Some things are inherited long before they are comprehended. In 2001, a heavy storm system flattened part of the North Field 2 weeks before harvest. Lodge corn meant slower cutting, higher loss, greater strain on equipment. Matthew suggested hiring a custom crew to speed through the damaged acreage. The cost would eat into margin but protect yield. Daniel did not dismiss the idea. They ran the numbers together at the kitchen table. Even after custom fees, they would remain solvent. But hiring help would mean breaking a pattern established decades earlier. Matthew sensed that tension. "It's not debt," he said carefully. Daniel nodded. "No, it isn't." They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Daniel said, "Then do it." It was the first time outside labor entered the harvest. It did not feel like surrender. It felt like adaptation without dependency. The distinction mattered. When the season closed profitably despite the storm, Daniel felt something he had not allowed himself before. Flexibility without fear. That winter he opened the desk drawer again and removed Thomas's letter one last time. The ink had faded further. The paper thin at the folds. He read it slowly, not searching for instruction, just remembering the fear behind the words. "I am afraid of burying another Mercer." He folded it and placed it back. Then he added a new envelope beside it. He wrote Matthew's name across the front. Inside, he placed a single sheet of paper. "If you are reading this," he wrote, "then you are standing where I once stood. Control what you can. Respect what you can't. Never confuse growth with strength. And remember that land is patient. It outlives ego." He sealed it. Years moved forward quietly. Daniel aged into the chair by the window overlooking the south half, the same view Thomas had held in his final days. The fields did not change shape. Seasons rotated with predictable unpredictability. Prices rose and fell. Machinery advanced. Through it all, the farm remained intact. Paid for, operated deliberately. When Daniel passed at 81, it was without drama. No accident, no machine, just breath that did not return. Matthew found him in the morning, the envelope still in the desk drawer untouched. The funeral filled the church again. Not out of spectacle, out of respect. During the reception afterward, Carl Dawson, retired now, slower in step, approached Matthew. "Your father held the line," Carl said. Matthew nodded. He said the line was already there. Carl looked toward the distant fields visible through the church basement window. Most of us never saw it. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the dishes were washed, Matthew opened the drawer and found both envelopes. He read his grandfather's first, then his father's. He did not cry. He did not speak. He walked outside into the cooling air and looked across 312 acres that had passed through 3 generations without ever belonging to a bank. The next morning, he uncovered the old gleaner once more. He stood in front of it alone. The welds were rough, the paint uneven, the machine obsolete, but it had done what it needed to do when it needed to do it. It had forced a choice. Matthew placed his hand on the steel and understood fully that the machine had never been the story. The frost had never been the story. Even the acreage had never been the story. The story had been control. Fear-faced but not obeyed. Discipline chosen over ease. And a quiet decision made in a field at dawn decades earlier to earn ground instead of finance it. Matthew covered the machine again carefully. Outside, Caleb waited by the newer combine, ready for another season. "You coming?" the boy called. Matthew stepped into the sunlight and nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I'm coming." And as the engine turned over and the first row of the new harvest fell into the header, the farm continued. Not louder, not larger, but still owned, not owed, exactly as it had been decided long ago.